In this video, we're going to talk about Effects by Alan Jenkins, and I'm going to start by introducing a quotation that Jenkins speaks of as one of his inspirations, not simply for this poem, but just more in general. For him as a writer, he feels as if he's been inspired by some other writers and their reflections on the process of writing. And what this poem does is really illustrate how important context is when you consider the life of a writer and the ways in which that life has influenced their work. Some of the elements of this quotation really bring to light how important some of those contextual connections are. So he quotes, "The ultimate aim of the poet should be to touch our hearts by showing his own, and not to exhibit his learning or his fine taste or his skill in mimicking the notes of his predecessors." And I include this quote for this instance because actually this poem isn't laden with poetic devices. It's not using devices for the sake of it. Where devices are being used, they're very strategically placed in order to emphasize particular ideas. But certainly the form of the dramatic monologue really suits this notion of the poet showing his own heart, showing to us how he thinks, how he feels, his reactions, and within the skill of mimicking other writers, some of that sincerity perhaps gets lost. So what he's trying to emphasize here is that this is his own voice, and it's not necessarily the most poetic poem. It's not filled with all these poetry features that you would find in some of the more classic poems. But what it is honest and at times quite brutal and reflective, and the form really suits that purpose and intention. What is interesting is that the use of the continuous stanza form for dramatic monologue, again, it's the most effective choice really to be the most natural form of dramatic monologue, but the sense of continuity really reflects perhaps that process of thinking about something and the stream of consciousness that might be associated with this type of poem. So in terms of tense here, it's actually quite interesting the way in which Jenkins uses disruptions within his structure to remind us of reflection and current moment, as in we are brought into the present, and that present thinking contrasts to perhaps some of the past recollections that he's having. So discourse and structure is very important in this poem. It really does move us through the different things that we're supposed to be able to connect with for the persona. "I held her hand that was always scarred." Now, in this instance, always is a really good reminder of the sense of affection that the mother clearly had for the children. So we've got this notion that there is this kind of perpetual damage that is done to her skin as a result of caring for the children. And it's this moment of holding her hand and being forced to connect with that damage that Jenkins actually realizes that actually these scars are demonstrations of her affection, and there's maybe a moment of guilt in the realization that it's taken her death to fully appreciate how that's the case. He talks about chopping and slicing from knives that lay in wait, the bowls of washing up. Now, in this instance, if you start to look at the semantic field here, you've got very much a lexical field of domesticity, of the domestic sphere that he was obviously raised in, and how some of this imagery or domestic imagery really emphasizes to us how his connections with his mother were obviously ones in which she was simply doing everyday things to care for the children, and he's maybe not noticed how those were the ways that she showed that affection, or he's never really appreciated that perhaps. That's emphasised as well in the next line, the knuckles being reddened and rough from scrubbing. If you consider the assonant emphasis there, the rhotic, reddened, rough scrubbing, there's an anger or a sense of struggle that's being emphasised there through the alliterative techniques. And we start to appreciate perhaps that maybe the children weren't so appreciative of how this mother had shown her affections. They were obviously wanting affection in different ways and were maybe not grateful about these shows of affection that have clearly had a physical impact on her. At saucepan, frying pan, cup and plate, and giving love the only way that she knew. And again, we get now, as we move into this poem, through the dramatic monologue form, the pragmatics are suggesting that it's only in these reflections that the persona is really coming to the realization that this was how his mother was showing those affections, and he feels perhaps guilty that he hasn't realized that before. In each cheap cut of meat in roast and stew, old-fashioned food she cooked and we ate. Now, the semantic field of food here is one of tradition, but I think you could look at the pragmatic implication of cheap cut of meat there. There is perhaps a resentment that in his childhood they weren't given particularly elaborate, expensive food, and there's a hint later on that perhaps his adulthood has compensated for that. But we can imply as well that there is this sense of struggle, that despite probably not having a lot of money, the mother has gone to quite significant effort to care for the children, to make sure they're not hungry and make sure they're cared for. And I saw that they had taken off her